Hi everyone. This is a quick video about a new paper that I just published called Why the Great Philosophers Aren't That Great. So a rather controversial thesis, but I wanted to run through the reasons that I give for that. So unlike many other areas in human inquiry, the sciences most obviously, philosophy has this idea of great thinkers in its past. So we still look up to, in some ways, and defer to figures like Plato, Kant, maybe Hegel, the big names. Whereas in the sciences, you don't typically go back and read the works of Isaac Newton or Kepler, something like that, right? Even though they're recognized to be important figures in the history of science, we typically think the best way to learn science is to study the current state of the field. So philosophy is a bit different insofar as its important figures in its history remain subjects of study, direct study by philosophers themselves. So to me, the notion of a great philosopher seems problematic in various ways. So this paper was recently published in the journal Cultura. Link below. It's open access, so check it out if you're interested. But the basic claim of the paper is that the so-called great philosophers simply aren't that great. So my view that I defend in the paper instead is that these were intelligent thinkers who happened to be at the right place at the right time in the history of ideas. So I'll run through that and try and show why I think it's a plausible claim to make. So the first thing I suggest for trying to evaluate any philosophical work, including that of the so-called great philosophers, would be the peer review test. So as stated, on this test, experts consider the merits and deficiencies of some past philosophical work independently of its authorship or its historical importance. In other words, as if the work was under anonymous review. So imagine that you're an expert in the field. You get this paper submitted to you in which the author, who's anonymous, presents these arguments for the immortality of the soul. And it's your job as an expert to try and evaluate those arguments and the quality of the paper as a whole. You don't know that the author happens to be Plato, right? But insofar as philosophy is supposed to be focused on the truth and justification, quality of arguments, the authorship really shouldn't matter. So that's a crucial claim. Now I state that if we honestly applied this test to the so-called great philosophers, we would find all sorts of flaws in their work, and that we would probably end up recommending that the work be either rejected or highly revised. So why is that? So I go through some of the flaws of the great philosophers. So one would simply be bad arguments. A really classic case is John Stuart Mill's argument that pleasure is the only good thing in life, right? So in other words, he claims to prove, or at least support, the idea of hedonism, that there's nothing good aside from pleasure. And the argument that he gives, most philosophers agree, is not a very good one. So I reproduce it here, but the basic problem, as Bertrand Russell pointed out, was that Mill seems to assume that because pleasure is the only thing that human beings in fact desire, it is the only thing that can be good, right? Which just seems to be a non sequitur. Obviously, I can go into much more detail in the paper itself. That's just one example. You can take other examples from Descartes, for example. I mentioned Plato earlier. And there's just something in these arguments that I think if we considered them honestly, independently of their authorship, the experts in the field would just say these are not very good. They're subject to some obvious problems or really clear counterexamples, or they just employ certain fallacies in their reasoning. All right, so that's the claim. Another problem with the great philosophers is simply implausibility. So a lot of their claims, like again, think of Plato's forms, Leibniz's monads, Malebranche's occasionalism, which is roughly the idea that every time there's a so-called cause and effect relationship, it's really God stepping in to make the effect follow from the so-called cause. These are pretty outlandish and arguably metaphysically excessive ideas. Again, imagine that somebody submitted this as an anonymous work to an expert. What would the expert think of those claims? Would they be impressed by the idea that we need to assume that God is stepping in to make causality work, since otherwise we can't explain it? Now, maybe you'd find some people who find that plausible enough, but it's at least something that we might worry about with the so-called great philosophers. Another problem is so-called confused concepts. So the Stoics, for example, had this idea of preferred indifference, which is the idea that you should, in one sense, be indifferent towards factors outside of your control, right? The classic Stoic idea would be all that matters is virtue, which is always in your control. Things outside of your control, like being physically comfortable or being rich or having good coworkers or something like that, that's outside of your control, so you should be indifferent towards it. At the same time, they say that we should somehow have a preference for certain things, even though we're indifferent toward them. So yes, I'm indifferent towards my own physical comfort if I'm a good Stoic, but it's okay for me to prefer and in some sense want comfort and still to pursue it. Now, on the face of it, this seems like it might just be an incoherent concept, right? How could I be both indifferent towards something and at the same time have a preference regarding it? It would seem that one would exclude the other. And many critics of Stoicism have said just that. So, for example, Plutarch back in the old days. But since then, scholars, including in recent decades, have spent a lot of energy trying to make sense of the Stoic idea. How could it be possible that we're indifferent towards something and yet have a preference? Well, the most straightforward explanation is that there just isn't a good account for this, and that might explain why scholars have not come to any sort of convergence, some sort of accepted view on, yes, this is what the Stoics meant and it makes sense once you understand it. Rather, we see very complicated and competing accounts of how this seemingly incoherent notion can be made coherent. My suggestion, again, apply the peer review test. What are we likely to think about this? Well, probably this idea is just the sort of confused concept that it appears to be on the surface. Of course, maybe not, but the fact that the Stoics could not give this clear explanation of how preferred indifference ultimately makes sense seems to be a flaw, right, in their presentation. And this thought that maybe they had this brilliant, coherent idea underneath all of the sort of confused presentation. Well, it's possible, but why should we grant that sort of extra consideration? Okay. Another thing is falsehoods. So there's a great example in Petrarch's essay on his own ignorance and that of many others, in which he goes through this litany of things that that Aristotle is supposed to have said that are simply false. So claims about, I think crocodiles are in there, and elephants and things like that. And the idea is that philosophers often rely on assumptions that in future study prove to be false, right? Or at least unjustified. And finally, lack of clarity. So a number of philosophers are extremely difficult to read. Hegel's a classic example. And critics like Schopenhauer think that, well, the reason that Hegel sounds like a madman in his writing is because he basically was. There is no coherent philosophy underneath all of the jargon and all of the confusing verbiage, that Hegel was just a charlatan. Now, I don't know if that's true, but you could certainly see how someone might reach that conclusion. The idea being that if you have clear, interesting, coherent ideas, but try as you might, you just can't make them clear, you just can't communicate them, that's at least a pretty good reason to be skeptical that there really is something deep, interesting, and coherent underneath the surface. Obviously there might be, but again, that lack of clarity, which is not exactly uncommon in the history of philosophy, seems to be a flaw. So, okay, if the so-called great philosophers weren't just these geniuses who occupy a different intellectual strata from the rest of us, then what are they? Why have they come to be treated as important in the history of philosophy? And my hypothesis is simply that they happen to be at the right place at the right time. So the so-called timing hypothesis is that, for example, Kant's first critique, you had this debate between empiricism and rationalism, you had problems of skepticism, and Kant proposed that perhaps we should accept this thing that he called transcendental idealism, according to which the objects of our experience are ultimately conditioned and in a sense created by ourselves. So that this thing that we call experience and the nature that we seem to have experience of is ultimately a product of our minds. However, given that we supposedly have these universal rules of how we receive sensations and how we think of them according to concepts, Kant argued that you can get a universal and necessary body of knowledge. So you can actually do science in a way that escapes the problem of skepticism. Now, that's a really interesting and, as far as I know, very original idea. And according to the timing hypothesis, the reason that we consider Kant an important figure in the history of philosophy is because he had that idea at the right time. It was a kind of ingenious, very creative solution to some problems in philosophy at the moment, and it remains relevant today. However, if we look at the quality of Kant's arguments, there's often a lot left to be desired. Right? So common complaints, Kant's first critique, people say, well, where do these so-called 12 categories come from that are supposed to be the universal and necessary groundwork for all of our concepts that we use to think every possible object of experience? How do those actually come about? How does Kant know that it's 12 instead of, say, 13? Right? Where is he getting this? Another is Kant's schematism, that he thinks he needs to explain how do concepts and intuitions or our sensations connect to each other. And Kant gives this very obscure account of something called the schematism. It has something to do with time that somehow connects concepts with intuitions. And even Kant himself admits that ultimately this is a secret hidden in the human soul. Now, that could be true, but if we are peer reviewers of Kant's work, we're considering it anonymously, I think we'll have questions, right? And some pretty pointed questions that this just seems like a convenient solution to a problem that you've stumbled upon. It hasn't been clearly explained. It has not been convincingly argued for. It's just something that's sort of proposed to fill in the gaps. So where does that leave us? So why study the great philosophers, so-called great philosophers, if at all? Should we just perhaps kick them out of the canon and say, let's just focus on contemporary philosophy the same way that most scientists are going to focus on contemporary science, rather than looking to its history? So my counter-proposal is that although the great philosophers aren't especially brilliant or geniuses compared to the rest of us, they're just normal, flawed, smart individuals, nonetheless, we can find value in their work because of their creativity. And that's something that philosophers often overlook in the history of philosophy, that we tend to talk as if we're obsessed with arguments and clarity and things like that. But if that's what really ultimately matters in philosophy and nothing else, or nothing nearly as much as those, then it seems like the great philosophers, well, they're just not very good, right? But if instead we remember that philosophy is also a creative enterprise in which people come up with new ideas or come up with new problems and ways of thinking of those problems, we might say, well, that's an area in which we can consider philosophers to be very interesting and worth studying. So that's my suggestion. Given an application of the peer review test showing that the great philosophers are pretty wanting, and the timing hypothesis that says, well, the reason that they're important historically is because they had the right ideas at the right time, we can still, I think, find room for valuing their work, simply in appreciating their creativity and finding different ways of thinking, right? And that might also be a lesson for contemporary philosophy, right? That perhaps we should stop putting so much emphasis on argumentation, rigor, clarity, things like that, and give some more credence to the idea that perhaps creativity is an important part. Okay, so let me know what you think in the comments below. Otherwise, I'll see you next time.